Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor of the Washington Post. A week from tonight, we will be talking about the aftermath of the first debate of the 2024 general election, but a lot will happen before President Biden and Donald Trump take the CNN stage in Atlanta. Joining me now to discuss, Marianne Levine, national political reporter at the Washington Post. Marianne, welcome to First Look.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So neither Biden nor Trump has been on a debate stage since they ran against each other in 2020. That was 4 years ago. So let's dive into to debate prep and start with the president. We know he's going to Camp David for debate prep. What exactly is that going to look like?
Well, we know that President Biden has brought in Ron Klain to help him with debate prep. It seems like this is one of those events that President Biden will enter a much more formal process than former President Trump. He's going to be at Camp David for the next few days, and I think we can expect him to be going through policy questions, to be preparing to have people coming in and playing Trump, and I think it's going to be a heads down focused process for the current president.
Yeah, one more before we move on to Donald Trump. How much is the experience of President Obama in his first debate back in 2012 against Mitt Romney, which I remember watching thinking, ooh, that was not good. How much of that is sort of hanging over debate prep for President Biden as he gets ready for his first debate as for the reelection?
Well, I think Obama and Biden faced different sets of issues. I mean, I think that for Biden, a big factor here is going to be whether or not he can overcome voter anxieties about his age. So I think that there's a different mandate here in terms of just ensuring to come in prepared and avoiding slip ups and avoiding and trying to overcome the question of whether or not he is too old to have a second term. And so I think that that's a very different challenge from what Obama had. And one thing Republicans have done with Biden is at times they've set the bar really low. And so for example, with the State of the Union address, he performed pretty well and surprised people there, or surprised a lot of Republicans. And so I think that the question and the factors of what Obama needed to do versus what Biden needs to do in this debate are quite different.
All right. So now let's talk about Donald Trump. How is he preparing for the showdown in the ATL?
So former President Trump has a different strategy than President Biden. I mean, I think the Trump campaign is definitely trying to suggest that he is not going to the same lanes as Biden is, because they argue that Trump has had rallies, that he's quicker on his feet than Biden is their argument. So it kind of feels like they're to some extent downplaying the amount of preparation that he's doing, but he appears to be having more informal discussions with people. Like he's had conversations with different senators like Marco Rubio and Eric Schmidt and JD Vance, kind of going through potential debate questions, but he's not going through this process of having someone, for example, play Biden and going through a more formal process like he did, for example, when Chris Christie was a stand-in for the 2020 debate prep.
I j- a week from tonight is going to be real fun because we will have witnessed something absolutely incredible. Also, it will be the first time in history that you have a current president debating a former president for the privilege of being the next president. So you've done a lot of reporting about Trump's looming vice presidential pick. You wrote this week that a rival from 2016 has now emerged as a finalist. Who is that? And what would he bring, assuming it's a he, what would he bring to the ticket?
So Senator Marco Rubio, who of course ran against Trump in 2016, is now a finalist for being Trump's running mate. And it's for some who haven't been paying close attention over the last 8 years, it is a contrast to the 2016 run when the two of them went to head, had juvenile insults, but over the last 8 years, Rubio and Trump have developed a pretty close relationship. And the argument for Rubio is that, he's young. Trump likes that he's good on TV. And there's the argument that he could help expand Trump's reach with non-white voters.
Hmm. Is the fact that Senator Rubio is also from Florida, is that going to be a problem?
So that could be a potential issue. Basically, Rubio's allies say that if Rubio moves before the electoral before the electors get together and vote, then they think that they can circumvent the constitutional provision that a Florida elector can't vote for both Trump and Rubio if they're Florida residents. So it's kind of complicated, but
Right.
basically Rubio's allies argue that if he moves after the election, should he and Trump win in a hypothetical ticket, that's a solvable problem. Now, the question though is this something that would invite lawsuits? Is this something that would invite legal challenges from Democrats? That's one issue that a Republican lawyer I spoke to raised at the prospect of both Trump and Rubio being on the ticket. But the campaign has said that they don't see it as an insurmountable problem if Trump does pick Rubio.
Okay, so there are at least, you've also reported that there are at least 8 people who've been asked by the Trump campaign to submit paperwork. They've gotten the vetting papers. Okay, so who are they? And more specifically, to my mind, is Elise Stefanik, Congresswoman Stefanik of New York, is she one of them?
Elise Stefanik is one of the eight people who've received paperwork from the Trump campaign that we've reported on. She is someone who has become a very staunch Trump ally over the last few years, especially with Trump's first impeachment trial or first impeachment in the House. And so she's one person who is in the running. But there are also many others. The top three that we
Yeah.
often hear about, in addition to Rubio, are Governor Doug Burgum, as well as Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio. Governor Burgum is someone who also ran against Trump in the last Republican primary last year, but he and Trump have become pretty close. Trump likes that Burgum is a self-made businessman and has executive experience as governor of North Dakota. J.D. Vance is someone who his allies think could embrace more of this populist mantle and represents a younger generation of MAGA. And so I think that there are different pros and cons for the different candidates. Senator Tim Scott, who also ran last year against Trump, but notably did not really criticize him during his presidential run, is also someone who's a potential contender. There's the argument that with Trump trying to make inroads with Black voters, Tim Scott could help with that. He also ran on a pretty optimistic message, and he is popular with a lot of donors.
What is Trump looking for other than blind loyalty? Because I'm just wondering, does he play vice presidential does he do vice presidential calculus the way other folks have done vice presidential calculus for 200 and some years?
I think loyalty is definitely a top priority for the former president. And what in reporting about this process, it does seem like it's a process that's a little bit different from past vice presidential searches. Those who are close to the president think that he's just going to essentially just make up his mind at some point in terms of personal connection and who he perhaps is comfortable with. But we've reported that he's privately asked people who can help him win. I think being on television and being good at being on TV is something that Trump cares a lot about. But loyalty definitely seems to be a big priority for him, as well as someone who he feels could potentially step into the job. And I think that whoever he picks will have it's a potential signal of who could lead the Republican Party once Trump leaves office.
I think my big thing is he's all about central casting,
Yeah,
and that the
exactly.
person has to look the part. And so, as much as I think Elise Stefanik or Governor Burgum, that's that that's who I'm keeping my eye on. Marianne Levine, national political reporter at the Washington Post. Thank you for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thanks for having me.
Time for the Opinions Roundtable, so let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post columnists E.J. Dionne in the top Brady Bunch box and George Will in just beneath E.J. Post Washington Post columnist E.J. George, welcome back to First Look.
Great to be with you.
Okay, so before I will come to the vice presidential sweepstakes. I want to go back to the debate. EJ, what will you be looking for next Thursday when President Biden and Donald Trump square off in Atlanta?
Well, I think what we should look for is sort of previewed by the problems Trump has had in messaging this debate, because Trump for months has said that Biden is infirm, he's incapable. You talk about setting expectations for Joe Biden really, really low. And suddenly he realizes this is a big mistake, because every time on a big stage that Biden has had to do something, whether in the debates in 2020 or for that matter, in the debates back in 2012 against Paul Ryan, when he was kind of pulling up the spirits of the Obama campaign back then, or the State of the Union, he always rises to these kinds of occasions. And I think he's likely to do that again. So Trump was trying to say, well, he'll be, hyped up, implying he'll be on drugs or something, but he couldn't stick with that in the course of his speech. So that's one thing I'm looking for. On Biden's side, I'm looking for his doing two things that are a bit in conflict. He really wants to rally his base, because if he can pull Democratic groups back to him, he could rise in the polls pretty quick. But he needs moderate and moderately conservative Republicans in the suburbs, Republican-leaning voters who know that Trump is a real threat to our institutions. And so I think he's going to be throwing out a democracy and respect our institutions message. With Trump, he needs to be reassuring to conservatives who don't like Biden but don't trust him. And I'm just not sure he can pull that off. So at the risk of lowering expectations for Trump, I think he's going to have a really hard time walking his line, much harder than Biden will have walking the one he has to go.
And so, George, I want to get your view on this, but you had a recent column where you outlined several questions for the Biden-Trump debate that you wrote would be, quote, useful. Give us a couple useful George Will questions for the candidates. Oh, is George frozen? I think George is frozen.
Well,
all right.
Would concern the train wreck that we're in the middle of. We're in the middle of the most predictable national crisis, which is the big pardon.
Oh, we could hear you, George, and then you were unfrozen for a hot second. Now you're frozen again. All right, I'm not sure how we're technically going to do this. So EJ, I'm going to come back to you. I'm just wondering, are these debates even useful, especially in a country that is so evenly divided, and especially when it comes to Donald Trump supporters? Like, there's nothing he can say or do that would dislodge the most faithful Trump voter from him. So what purpose are these debates?
Well, I think, first of all, I feel I've read George for so many years faithfully. I feel like channeling him, even though we don't always agree.
Oh, good. So you go ahead.
On your question, I think that dislodging the Trump base is hopeless, but the Trump base is not the key to this election. Trump can get his whole base and nothing else, and he'd lose. That's why I think it's hard for Trump to do what Trump needs to do, because he loves nothing more than making his base happy and having them love him back. And in a debate like this, he needs to say, I'm not going to be a dictator. That's the question I'd like to ask him, by the way. Is you said you wanted to be a dictator for a day. Would you please explain? And really only for a day? But that's a real problem for him. Whereas I think Biden is a more conventional politician and can do several things at the same time.
We have the great George Will back and clear in focus. George, give us some of those useful questions for the candidates.
Well, the one that interests me most is, as I was saying, we're in the middle of the most predictable crisis in American history, which is the fiscal train wreck of our mounting public debt, which means that when, not if, when the cost of borrowing goes to 5%, we're already paying more on debt service than we are on defense. We're paying more on debt service than we are on Medicare. And it simply explodes the budget. Both candidates are committed to not doing anything about it. They said, we're not going to touch the entitlement programs, Medicare and Social Security, that are driving all this. I'd like to hear them talk about that. But let me go back to the poll for a minute, because EJ talks about the polls being close, and they are. But as Charlie Cook, the man of the Cook Report, tirelessly says, the Democratic candidate has to win the popular vote by about 3% in order to get to 270 electoral votes, because the Democratic vote is inefficiently distributed. Biden will carry California by 5 or 6 million votes. Doesn't help him. So these polls, to the extent that they ignore the particular polls in the swing states, aren't very informative at this point, the national polls.
Could I just say something on that? I agree entirely that the swing states are everything, because we have an electoral college, which I think is unfortunate, but we do. So that's correct. This year, I think may be different, because I think you could see Biden winning states like New York and California by less than he did last time, and still maintain enough votes to win those swing states. So I'm very curious. Certainly what George says has been true in recent elections. Biden won the last election by 7 million popular votes and barely carried the 3 key states that he needed to win. But this time, I think the math may be a little different, and we won't know that until after all the votes are counted.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn our attention to Donald Trump's selection of a vice presidential nominee. George, we polled 16 of our opinion columnist colleagues about the best VP choice for Donald Trump, and South Carolina Senator Tim Scott came out on top. Do you agree?
Wrong South Carolinian. It seems to me that where Trump was, pause for the laugh track, choose as Jack Kennedy did in 1960. He chose the man who ran best against him in the run-up to the convention, Lyndon Johnson. Reagan picked the man who ran best against him in 1980, George Herbert Walker Bush. The best candidate for him to pick would be Nikki Haley, both for her talents and for her political accomplishments. That, of course, won't happen. I have proposed 49% seriously a constitutional amendment that says no one shall be eligible to be president or vice president who is or ever has been a United States senator. It seems the Senate is a terrible, particularly the Senate today, is a terrible incubator of executive talent. Therefore, I would eliminate Rubio, Scott, and Vance for various reasons, but that one being senators is uppermost. The only senator on the list who it seems to me is a plausible president is Tom Cotton. Beyond that, I have no suggestions other than to remind Mr. Trump of something I think he knows, which is this almost never makes any difference, other than in 1960 when it's arguable Kennedy could not have been elected if we're not running in the drifting rightward south with Lyndon Johnson.
Wow, Tom Cotton. All right, so EJ, if the Trump campaign came to you and asked your advice, which it won't, who's the person?
I was going to say, run the laugh track right there.
Right. So, but who do you think Donald Trump should pick? In all seriousness.
Well, I actually agree with George that Nikki Haley would be the best choice. And the good news for the Biden campaign is that there is no way in the world that Donald Trump will choose Nikki Haley as his running mate, because she was so critical of him. He challenges her loyalty. And so beyond her, I don't know who helps Trump. Here's what I am amazed about is that anyone would want this job. Anyone would want to go through what it takes to have this job. This is the abasement Olympics or the self-debasement Olympics. Take your pick. All these people have to sort of bow low before Trump, and I think make themselves look worse than they did before they entered this. I think Tim Scott's a good example. Tim Scott was somebody who was quite widely liked when he was running for president against Trump and before as a senator. And he's had to do all sorts of things to show his loyalty to Trump that I think have made an awful lot of people who used to like him think less of him. But the last point is, why would you want this job when you know from Mike Pence's experience that if you don't do absolutely anything that this man wants you to do, he'll incite his supporters to say you'll be hanged. It's really bad to work for somebody who demands absolute loyalty and returns absolutely none in return.
Let's shift gears and talk foreign policy. This week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took the unusual step of releasing a video in English critical of the United States by claiming it was withholding weapons and ammunition from Israel. George, what's going on here?
Terrifically important video, if true. That is, if the United States is trying to fine-tune from a great distance this conflict in Gaza by rationing essential munitions. At the end of the day, all wars end. This war will end. And when it ends, we will be back to where we were, which is that the only really reliable ally we have in this combustible region is Israel. And that will, I think, soon repair the damage. This survived the Eisenhower action in 1956 when he pulled the plug with financial leverage on the British, French, and Israeli attack on the Suez Canal. We quickly went back to understanding the importance of Israel, and we shall again.
EJ, is this yet another example of how damaged the relationship between Israel and the United States is now?
Well, I think it's an example of what's happened to the relationship between Bibi Netanyahu and President Biden. And Netanyahu knows he is in a heap of trouble at home. If there were an election next week, Netanyahu would lose. The strategy he pursued in Gaza has, to be very mild about it, just not achieved what he set out to, and in fact, has resulted in the alienation of Israel from an awful lot of countries and people who were very strong supporters of Israel before this war. And so Netanyahu is looking for others to blame his situation on. And he has had a lot of success over the years of blaming Democratic American presidents, even people who supported him. And Biden thought he could escape what Obama went through by his long track record of supporting Israel, his extraordinary gesture in going to Israel, embracing Netanyahu after October 7th, in acknowledging the horror of October 7th. I think that still makes a difference to a lot of Israelis. It doesn't make any difference to Bibi Netanyahu.
Mm-hmm. And in the time that we have left, which is more than 5 minutes, which is great, George, as you well know, we lost one of the greatest athletes of all time this week, Baseball Hall of Famer Willie Mays. And you wrote a wonderful column about Mays. And one of the points you made is that his intelligence was underestimated. In what way?
Well, he was a student of the game. People say, what an instinctive ball player. Let me tell you a story. Bill Russell, when he was with the Boston Celtics, their great senator, became by some metrics the winningest athlete in American history. And before he was with the Celtics, he took the University of San Francisco to the NCAA championship. And all the while, people said, what a great natural athlete Bill Russell was. And he finally said, if I'm such a natural athlete, why did I spend all those afternoons as a child on the steaming asphalt courts of Oakland, California, honing my skills? People said that about Willie Mays. He had so much fun playing baseball and was so good at it. People said, what a natural. Well, it was obviously a great natural talent. All you had to do was look at his wrists. His wrists were enormous, and to whip the bat speed through the strike zone. But he was so intelligent in understanding how the 9 players on the defensive team shift and move around when he hits the ball. He was rarely surprised. I'd be surprised. It was said of Joe DiMaggio he was never thrown out at third base in his entire career. I bet that was true of Willie Mays also. He's the classic 5-tool player, could run, catch, throw, hit, and hit for power. But beyond that, if he had not played so many years in capacious, windy, cold Candlestick Park in San Francisco, he, not his son, the son of Bobby Bonds, and it would be Willie Mays, not Barry Bonds, Willie Mays' godson, who is today the all-time home run king.
Would you say that Mays is the top 5 all-time of baseball greats?
Top 3: Babe Ruth, Willie Mays, and Henry Aaron. That's it.
So you number 2. EJ, President Obama awarded Willie Mays the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015, and this week, former President Obama said that Mays was, quote, an inspiration to an entire generation. How would you describe Mays' legacy?
Well, first, I want to thank George Will for raising Bill Russell's name on the day that the Boston Celtics are having their parade to celebrate their victory in the NBA. This is one of my favorite teams of all times, this year's Celtics. So thank you, George. I think that when you read through, that Mays inspired some extraordinary commentary, including George's, and I think his broad point that you talk about a natural and you don't look at all the work they put in is so important to all kinds of things in life. But Willie Mays' death inspired some extraordinary writing by people. And over, the word that came up was joy. Jason Gay, the really great sports writer for the Wall Street Journal, said that Mays was a joy delivery device. And that was true because he could perform in every single part of the game, everything that you're called upon to do as a baseball player. A lot of people can do 2 or 3 of the things that are important right. He did it all right. And he inspired people. Tom Boswell, the Post's other great baseball writer, said that Mays made us normal folks feel just a little crazy, a little more alive in a good sort of way. This is a moment when we need more joy in our public life. And it was really wonderful to see how much joy Willie Mays called forth over the last week about an extraordinary career.
Excuse me, George, is there a baseball player today who embodies the intelligence of Willie Mays or even the joy that EJ is talking about of Willie Mays?
Well, baseball is becoming younger, which means you've got a lot of people who are into this 162 games and 185 days grind, who bring that joy. Corbin Carroll on the Diamondbacks. Here in beloved Washington, I think C.J. Abrams is going to bring some of this, and Trey Lipscomb and some of the young players coming up on the Nationals. As baseball gets younger, it's rational, but baseball's economic model has been weird for years. These big contracts go to the players, and people are really buying their past, not their future decline. Baseball getting younger, we're not going to have another Willie Mays. They just don't make 2 of them in the same millennium. But you're going to see that kind of ebullience and energy on the ball field that will bring back memories of Mays.
What do you think, EJ?
I think George is right in terms of the durability of careers. Also, of players staying with the same teams over a very long period of time. But I still think that it's a paradox. I think that what George says about the grind and preparation and doing the work day after day is important. but also playing with this joy, this commitment is you can't you need them both. That's why Bill Russell, if we can jump games, because we lost him this year, was just that kind of player, and also someone with an extraordinary social commitment. When I was a little kid, I thought Bill Russell's first name was Rebound because you heard that over and over and over again on the radio. And I think that we're losing a lot of giants this year. But Mays, I don't think his career is replicable. Period.
EJ Dion, George Will, that'll do it for us on Sports Center. I'm kidding. We got to go. Thank you both very much for coming back to First Look. Have a great weekend.
Thank you both.
And thank you for watching. For more of these important conversations, sign up for a Washington Post subscription. Get a free trial by visiting WashingtonPost.com/live. Again, that's Washington Post, all one word, .com/live. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.